They said the land was cursed. They said any man foolish enough to buy it deserved whatever ruin came next. And when Elias Crowder counted out his last $10 onto that warped wooden counter, every soul in Harlan County agreed. That quiet, stubborn young man had just purchased his own grave. But here's what nobody saw coming. The woman sent to destroy him fell in love with him instead. The enemy who tried to ruin him ended up saving him. And the dead land everyone abandoned? It became the most talked about ranch in all of Montana. Stay with me until the very end, because this story will remind you what it truly means to fight for something when the whole world tells you to quit. And before we begin, if stories like this move you, hit that subscribe button and become part of our family. Drop a like and tell me in the comments, what city or country are you watching from right now? I want to see how far this story travels. The land didn't look like much. It didn't look like anything, really. Just a long, ugly stretch of frozen Montana earth baking under a colorless November sky. The kind of sky that had no opinion about the men who lived beneath it. The fence posts that remained were leaning at wrong angles like drunk soldiers who'd given up. The barn, what was left of it, had one wall standing and three that had already surrendered to gravity and rot. The farmhouse sat slightly crooked on its foundation, as if the earth beneath it had quietly shifted away, wanting nothing more to do with the place. Elias Crowder stood at the edge of the property line and looked at all of it for a long time without saying a word. Behind him, the county land agent, a red-faced man named Dobbins, was already pulling his coat tighter against the wind and shifting his weight from foot to foot. He'd ridden 6 miles in cold weather to witness what he privately believed was either an act of great stupidity or temporary insanity. "You sure about this?" Dobbins asked. His voice had the careful tone of a man who didn't want to be blamed later. Elias didn't turn around. "Already signed the paper. I know you signed it. I'm asking if you're sure." "I signed it twice." Dobbins exhaled through his nose and stared at the back of the young man's head. 24 years old, lean in the way that meant he hadn't always had enough to eat, boots with a crack running along the left sole that he'd wrapped with thin wire to hold together. The coat was decent, probably the best thing he owned. "Elias," Dobbins tried again, softer this time. "3 families tried this land before you. The Hendersons, the Pruitts, the McCaslins, all 3 walked away. The winter of '82 killed the soil so bad that nothing came back right. People say the cold went so deep it changed something underground. You know what I'm saying?" Elias finally turned around. He had one of those faces that was hard to read. Not unfriendly, but contained, like he kept most of himself behind a door that didn't open easily. His eyes were dark brown and steady, not the kind that moved around nervously when someone was talking. "I heard about the Henderson family," he said, "and the others." "Then I know they left." He looked back at the land. "I'm not them." Dobbins opened his mouth, closed it, and decided he had done his civic duty. He pulled out the folded documents, got the final signatures he needed, pocketed his copy, and rode back toward town, certain he would be telling this story at the saloon within the hour. Elias stood alone on the property until the sound of hooves faded into the wind. Then, slowly, he walked to the collapsed fence line, crouched down, and picked up one of the fallen posts. It was heavy, waterlogged, half-rotted through. He turned it in his hands, feeling the weight of it. He set it aside, picked up another. This one was better, still solid at the core, just weathered on the outside. He stood up, put the post over his shoulder, and carried it to where the line should have been. That was how it started. Elias hadn't come to Montana with grand ideas or rehearsed speeches about destiny. He'd come because he'd run out of other options, which, as he'd learned, was sometimes the only thing that forced a man to be brave. He'd grown up in Ohio, the 3rd son of a farmer who worked a decent piece of land but never owned it outright. His father was not a cruel man, but he was a tired one, the kind of tired that settles into the bones and becomes a permanent condition. His mother had died when Elias was 11, and after that the house had gotten quieter in ways that had nothing to do with noise. He'd left at 17, not dramatically, not with any particular plan. He just packed what he could carry and walked south until he found work, then west until he found more. He spent 2 years on a cattle drive out of Kansas, another year and a half working for a sheep outfit in Wyoming, that paid poorly but taught him more about land and animals than any schoolhouse could have. He saved money the way some men save breathing, slowly, steadily, like it was necessary for survival. He didn't drink much, didn't gamble, didn't have expensive tastes or expensive habits. He slept in bunkhouses, ate what was put in front of him, and spent his evenings sitting outside in whatever weather there was, thinking. What he thought about mostly was land. Not borrowed land, not worked land, not someone else's land. His own. With his name attached to it. Something that couldn't be taken away when the season ended, or the owner decided he didn't need hands anymore. He'd heard about the Crowder tract. That wasn't his name on it, just a coincidence that had struck him as strange when Dobbins first mentioned it. From a traveling farrier who'd passed through the Wyoming outfit in early autumn. The man had mentioned it as a curiosity, a joke, almost. 240 acres of Montana nothing, selling for a fraction of what it should be worth because nobody in their right mind wanted it. Elias had asked him to write down the county and the land agent's name. The farrier had laughed. "You're not seriously—" "Write it down, please, Bob." He built a temporary shelter the first week, not in the farmhouse, which needed work he wasn't ready to tackle yet, but a simple lean-to attached to the one standing wall of the barn. He covered it with canvas he'd brought in his pack and cut pine branches for insulation. It was cold. It was not comfortable. He slept fine. Every morning he woke before light, ate hardtack and dried venison he'd packed in, and went to work on the fence. The fence first. That was his rule for himself. Everything else, the barn, the house, the fields, depended on having a perimeter. Without a perimeter, you didn't have a ranch. You had a suggestion of one. He worked methodically, not frantically. He had learned a long time ago that frantic work was usually wasted work. You moved fast, made mistakes, and spent twice as long fixing them. He'd dig a post hole, set the post, tamp it, check the level, move to the next one. Post by post, foot by foot, the line began to take shape. The people of Harlan County noticed, not in a friendly way at first, more the way people notice something unusual that they haven't decided how to feel about yet. Riders passing on the far road would slow their horses and look. A few of the neighboring ranch hands rode closer to the fence line on their daily rounds, apparently by coincidence, though they always seemed to find reasons to linger. Nobody stopped. Nobody offered to help. Nobody waved. That was fine with Elias. He wasn't there to make friends. He was there to build something. Bog. It was on the 11th day that Clara Whitlock appeared. He heard the horse before he saw her, a confident, steady canter that said the rider knew what they were doing and wasn't in a hurry to prove it. He straightened up from the post hole he was digging, shielded his eyes against the pale winter sun, and watched the rider approach. She was maybe 22, 23, dark auburn hair pinned back under a practical brown hat. She wore a riding coat that was expensive. He could tell by the cut, even from a distance. But she sat her horse like someone who hadn't always ridden expensive ones. There was something direct about the way she moved, purposeful, without being aggressive. She pulled up about 10 feet from him and looked at the fence line. Then she looked at him. "You're the one who bought this place," she said. Not a question. "That's right. Clara Whitlock. My father owns the Whitlock Ranch, East Boundary." She gestured in that direction. "We share about a mile of property line." Elias nodded, leaning on his post-hole digger. Elias Crowder. She studied him the way people sometimes studied something they'd expected to be one thing and found out was another. "My father sent me." "I figured." A small pause. "He wanted me to speak with you about the land. He's prepared to make you an offer, better than what you paid. He'd like to acquire this parcel." Elias looked at her steadily. "He send you instead of coming himself?" Something moved across her expression. Not quite embarrassment, but something adjacent to it. He thought I might be more persuasive. Meaning he thought a woman would be harder for me to say no to. Her chin came up slightly. Meaning he thought I was the better negotiator. His words. Elias almost smiled. He turned and looked at the length of fence he'd completed, roughly 60 feet, carefully set, each post solid and plumb. Then he looked back at her. "Tell your father the land's not for sale." Clara didn't flinch, which he respected. A lot of people flinched when they didn't get the answer they expected. "He'll offer more," she said. "Then I'll say the same thing again." She looked at the fence posts, at the canvas lean-to, at the ruined barn behind him. He could see her doing arithmetic in her head, calculating what kind of person spent real money on something this broken, this apparently hopeless. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "You can ask. Do you actually believe this land is worth saving, or are you just too stubborn to admit a mistake?" It was a sharp question. He appreciated that too. "Both, maybe," he said. "Does it matter?" She sat with that for a moment. Then, unexpectedly, she dismounted, tied her horse loosely to one of his new fence posts, walked over to where he'd been planning to set the next section. She crouched down, looking at the soil, then at the angle of the slope, then back at the fence line he'd completed. "This section," she said, "you're going to have a problem." Elias walked over. "What kind of problem?" "The winter of '82. The bad one." She pointed at the ground. "It changed how the water moves through here. The freeze went deep enough to shift the drainage. See this low point?" She indicated a slight depression, maybe 15 feet to the right of where he'd been planning to continue. "In spring, that becomes a channel, a real one. If your fence runs where you're planning, you'll have 3 posts underwater by April." Elias looked at the ground, looked at where she was pointing. His jaw tightened slightly. She was right. He could see it now that she'd said it. The subtle grade, the way the soil changed color slightly in that depression, indicating moisture that didn't dry out the way the surrounding ground did. He'd been about to make a mistake that would have cost him a week of rework, at minimum. "How do you know that?" he asked. "Because I grew up walking this land. Not this parcel specifically, but this whole valley. My father taught me to read the ground before I could read a book." She stood up. "The Hendersons, the family that was here before, their fence ran right through that low point. I saw it come apart in the spring of '83. Half their posts washed out in 2 days." Elias was quiet for a moment. "I would have figured it out," he said. And he meant it. He would have eventually, but it would have been after the damage was done. "Probably," she agreed. "But you'd have lost time." He looked at her. "Why are you telling me this?" She seemed to think about that genuinely, as if she wasn't sure herself. "Because you're going to find out anyway, and I'd rather you know now." A pause. "And because wasted work bothers me, even on someone else's property." There was a long moment where neither of them spoke. Wind moved through the dry grass. Her horse shifted its weight and exhaled a warm cloud into the cold air. "I need to shift the line about 12 feet east," Elias said finally, "starting from the 3rd post back." "That's what I'd do." "You want to help, or did you just come to deliver your father's offer?" Clara looked at him for a moment with an expression he couldn't quite categorize. Then she walked to where he'd set down his tools. "Show me where you want it," she said. They worked until the light started going, not talking much, but not in uncomfortable silence either. The kind of quiet that happens between two people who are both focused on the same thing. She knew what she was doing with fence work, which surprised him. Most ranchers' daughters he'd encountered had been kept well away from the physical labor. When they stopped, she was breathing a little harder than when she'd arrived, and there was dirt on her expensive coat that she didn't seem bothered by. "You came to convince me to leave," Elias said, as they stood looking at what they'd done. The fence line ran clean and true, bent slightly east right where she'd said it needed to be. "I did," she said. "Didn't work." "No." She untied her horse, started to mount, then paused with one foot in the stirrup. "My father's going to send someone else. Someone less persuadable than me." Elias picked up his digger. "Send them anyway." She looked at him one more time, that same look, like she was calculating something she didn't have all the figures for yet. Then she rode east toward the Whitlock land, until the darkness swallowed her, and the sound of the horse faded. Elias stood alone in the cold, looking at the fence, 60 feet further along the line than he'd been this morning, and straight, properly straight, set in the right place. He bent down, picked up his tools, and walked back to the lean-to. He had a long way to go. He knew that. The barn, the house, the fields, the water situation, All of it waited for him like a stack of debts he had voluntarily taken on. But the fence was coming together, post by post, foot by foot. And for tonight, that was enough. Clara told herself she was going back because of the fence. That was the reason she gave herself on the ride home that first evening, and it was the reason she repeated the next morning when she found herself already thinking about the angle of that eastern property line before she'd even finished her coffee. It was a practical concern. A legitimate one. The drainage situation on that parcel was more complicated than one afternoon of work could address, and if the fence went in wrong, it would affect the Whitlock property line too. She had a professional interest in making sure it was done correctly. That was what she told herself. She didn't tell her father she'd helped him work. Victor Whitlock was a large man in the way that some men from that era were large. Not just physically, though he was that too, broad across the shoulders with hands that looked like they'd been carved from something harder than ordinary skin and bone, but large in presence, in the space he occupied in a room, in the way conversations adjusted themselves around him without anyone quite deciding to do it. He'd built the Whitlock Ranch from 400 acres to nearly 4,000 over 30 years, and he wore that fact the way other men wore good coats, quietly but always. When Clara came in that evening, he was at the kitchen table going over cattle records with his foreman, a taciturn man named Gus, who had worked for the Whitlocks for 15 years and communicated mostly in single syllables. "Well?" Victor said, without looking up. He said no. Victor turned a page. "How much did he ask for?" "He didn't ask for anything. He said the land isn't for sale." Now Victor looked up. He had pale gray eyes that were more unsettling than cold, not unkind exactly, but absolutely direct in a way that made you feel like he was reading something written on the inside of your skull. "Everyone has a price," he said. "He didn't behave like a man who has a price." Then he behaved like a man who hasn't been given the right number yet. Victor looked back at his papers. "I'll send Gus next week, or I'll go myself." Clara set her hat on the hook by the door. "I don't think it'll matter who goes. It'll matter if I go." She didn't argue with that, because arguing with her father required a specific kind of energy she didn't always have, and tonight wasn't the night. She went upstairs, cleaned the dirt off her coat as best she could, and lay on her bed staring at the ceiling for a while, thinking about a man who'd counted his fence posts in the dark because the light had gone before he was ready to quit. She went back 3 days later. She came around 9 in the morning when the light was still low and gray, and found Elias already an hour into his work. She could tell by the way the sweat had started to darken the back of his shirt despite the cold. He was wrestling a post into a hole that was fighting him, the ground still half frozen and uncooperative, and he didn't stop when he heard her horse. Just kept working. She tied up and walked over without announcing herself. Picked up the tamping bar that was leaning against his supply sled and started compressing the soil around the base of the post he'd just set. He glanced at her sideways. "Didn't expect you back." "The east corner still needs to be addressed," she said. "You won't see the problem until spring, but by then it'll be too late to fix it without tearing out what you've already done. You came to save me from a problem I don't know I have yet." "I came because I was curious," she said, which was closer to the truth and surprised them both slightly. He straightened up, rolled his shoulder. She could see something was bothering him there, some old injury or a new strain from the work, and looked at her with that contained, measuring expression she was getting used to. "Curious about what?" "About whether you'd still be here." She started walking toward the east corner. "Come on, I'll show you what I mean." He followed, and she spent the better part of an hour walking the eastern boundary with him, showing him the places where the watershed had changed, where the land had a subtle memory of the catastrophic winter that nobody who hadn't grown up watching this valley would know to look for. She pointed out which soil was still good and which had been leached of something essential, which slopes would drain properly, and which would turn treacherous in the spring thaw. Elias listened without interrupting, which was not something she took for granted. In her experience, men, especially men who'd already started a project, listened to about 40% of what a woman told them, and then quietly made their own decisions anyway. Elias listened like someone who understood that information cost something and wasting it was a kind of theft. "You didn't learn all this from your father," he said at one point. "Some of it. The rest I learned on my own." She paused at a place where the fence line needed to jog slightly to avoid the problematic drainage. I used to walk the property boundaries every spring, from the time I was about 8. My father thought I was just riding for pleasure. A short pause. He didn't realize I was paying attention. Did you tell him? She made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. I told him once. He said I had good instincts for a girl. She said it without obvious bitterness, the way you say something that used to hurt but has had enough years to scar over. After that, I kept my instincts to myself. Elias was quiet for a moment. Then, he was wrong about that. I know he was. She looked at him. But thank you for saying it out loud. They marked the adjusted line with small stakes, which Elias would follow when he got to that section. It was methodical, unglamorous work, and they did it in a companionable quiet that Clara found, to her surprise, more restful than most conversations she'd had in recent memory. But she started coming every 2 or 3 days. There was no formal arrangement, no agreed-upon schedule. She'd simply find herself with the morning free and find herself riding west instead of east, and Elias would look up when he heard her coming and nod, and she'd tie her horse and pick up whatever needed doing. They worked their way along the fence line, then started clearing the debris from the collapsed sections of the barn. The barn was worse up close than it looked from a distance. 2 walls were completely gone, the roof had come down in sections, and whatever tools or equipment had been left by the previous owners had rusted or rotted into uselessness. But the foundation was solid, and one of the remaining walls had been built with old-growth timber that, Elias pointed out, was still stronger than anything he could source new. "You're going to try to salvage this," Clara said, standing inside what was left of the structure, looking up at the open sky where the roof should have been. "The bones are good," he said. He knocked his knuckle against the standing wall timber. "Cost half as much to restore as to build new." "That's an optimistic assessment." "That's a mathematical one." She looked at him. "Do you always think like that? In terms of what things cost versus what they're worth?" He considered the question more seriously than she expected. "I spent a long time having nothing," he said. "Teaches you to look at things pretty carefully before you throw them away." There was a weight in how he said it that she didn't press on. She'd learned already that Elias Crowder volunteered information at his own pace, in his own time, and that asking direct questions about his past was like reaching into a dark space. You might find something, but you also might startle something that didn't want to be disturbed. What she knew, he'd come from Ohio. He'd worked cattle drives and sheep outfits across 2 states. He had skills he'd clearly accumulated deliberately, not accidentally. The fence work was precise in a way that spoke to real training, and his knowledge of animal husbandry came out occasionally in the way he talked about what he planned to do with the land once it was ready. What she didn't know was the story underneath those facts, the shape of what had driven him to keep moving, keep saving, keep aiming for something that nobody around him seemed to think was reasonable. She found out some of it on a Thursday afternoon in December, when a cold front came in faster than expected and turned the sky the color of old pewter within about 40 minutes. They'd been working on clearing the barn floor and didn't notice until the temperature dropped sharply and the first hard gust of wind came through the missing wall sections like something with intention. "We need to get inside," Clara said. "The farmhouse," Elias said, already moving. The farmhouse was warmer than it had any right to be. He'd done work on it she hadn't seen, stuffed the worst of the gaps in the walls, replaced several broken windows with oiled canvas that let in light and kept out wind, gotten the iron stove in the main room functional again. It wasn't comfortable exactly. The floor was uneven, and there was a corner of the ceiling where something had gotten in and made a nest that he hadn't dealt with yet. But it was shelter, real shelter, and when he got the stove going and the warmth started pushing back the cold, the small main room felt surprisingly like a place where a person could think clearly. Clara sat in the one chair that seemed trustworthy. Elias had apparently tested the others and found them lacking because 3 of them were stacked against the wall in a way that suggested they'd been retired, and watched him feed wood into the stove. "How long did you save for this?" she asked. He didn't answer immediately, added another piece of wood, adjusted the damper. 7 years, he said. She absorbed that. 7 years to save $10? He looked at her, and something in his expression shifted, almost amused, which was a look she'd seen rarely enough on him that it still caught her off guard. $10 was what I had left after I bought the land. Oh. She felt slightly foolish. How much did you save altogether? Enough? He settled onto an upturned crate across from her. I kept about 40 back for supplies and tools. Rest went to the parcel. That's everything. That was the point of it. She looked at him across the small space, with the stove ticking between them and the wind starting to push harder against the walls outside. Doesn't that scare you? Having nothing left as a safety net? If I'd kept the safety net, he said, I'd have used it the first time things got hard. That's what safety nets are for. He looked at the stove. Didn't want the option of quitting. Clara was quiet for a moment, thinking about that, about her own life which had been defined by options. The option to stay or go, the option to choose or defer, the option to fight or accommodate. She'd had so many options that sometimes she felt like she'd never truly committed to any single direction. What if it doesn't work, she said. This place. What if by spring you've put everything into it and it still won't produce? Elias was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then I'll have learned a lot about this particular kind of soil and this particular kind of winter damage, and I'll try to find a way to apply that somewhere. That's not really an answer. It's the only honest one I've got. Outside, the wind had built itself into something serious. She was going to have to wait it out, and they both knew it. Elias got up and found a second, smaller crate for her to rest her feet on, and she accepted this practical small gesture without comment, because it was offered practically and without ceremony, which was the only way she could have accepted it. They talked for 2 hours while the storm pushed through. She told him about growing up on the Whitlock Ranch, the parts that were good, which were real and genuinely good, and the parts that weren't, which she described without self-pity but without glossing over either. Her mother had died when she was 16. After that, her father had pulled inward in the way that grief sometimes causes, and the ranch had become less a home and more an operation, something to be managed and optimized and expanded. She'd had every material comfort and had lacked for several years the specific comfort of feeling that anyone in the house actually wanted to know her thoughts. She hadn't said that to many people. She wasn't entirely sure why she said it to Elias, except that he listened in the particular way he had, attentive without leaning in, present without performing interest, and it made honesty feel less costly than it usually did. He told her some things too, about his father's farm in Ohio, about leaving at 17 and the specific quality of freedom that had felt, for the first few weeks, like terror wearing the wrong costume, about the cattle drive foreman who'd been the first person to tell him he had good instincts for land, a statement Elias had carried with him for years like a small stone in his pocket, taking it out occasionally when things were difficult. What was his name, she asked. Ferris. Old guy. Half-deaf from years around cattle. He almost smiled. He told me once that if you want to know what a piece of land will do, you don't look at it in good weather. You watch it in bad weather. Bad weather shows you the truth. She looked at the window where the storm was still making itself known. Is that what you're doing? Watching this land in bad weather? Partly. He looked at her when he said it, and she understood without him elaborating that he wasn't talking only about the land. She chose not to address that directly. It was too soon, and she was a person who'd learned to be careful with too soon things. But she held it in her mind after, held it with the carefulness you'd give something fragile and unexpected, something you weren't certain you'd been meant to find. Tet. When the storm cleared, she rode home in the early dark. Her father was waiting up, which he sometimes did and sometimes didn't, in a pattern she'd never been able to predict. He was in the front room with a lantern and his account books, though she suspected the account books were more prop than project at this hour. You were there again, he said. Not a question. I got caught in the storm. I waited it out. Victor looked at her over his reading glasses, a relatively new addition that he hadn't fully made peace with. Clara? Father? I want you to stop going to that property. She sat down across from him, which he hadn't invited, but which she did anyway because standing felt like the wrong posture for this conversation. Why? Because it's inappropriate. Because the man has nothing. Because he stopped, reorganized. Because I don't want you forming attachments to a situation that's going to fail. You don't know it's going to fail. I know this land. I've watched 3 families try it and walk away. He's not walking away. Not yet. Victor took off the glasses, set them down. Clara, I've worked my entire life to give you options. Good options. The kind of options your mother and I never had. His voice dropped slightly on her mother's name, the way it always did, like the word cost him something. I don't want you throwing those options away on a man with cracked boot soles and $40 to his name. She looked at her father, at the big, tired, well-intentioned man who loved her in the only way he knew how, which was to try to protect her from every difficulty he'd ever experienced himself. He's not nothing, she said quietly. He's one of the most capable people I've ever spent time with. Capability doesn't pay for Winters. No, but it builds toward something that can. She stood up. I'm not going to stop going, but I wanted you to know that I hear what you're saying. She went upstairs before he could respond. He didn't come after her, which was its own kind of answer. Her father was a man who pushed hard, and then occasionally recognized the moment to stop pushing and observe. She didn't know what conclusion he was drawing from what she'd said. She wasn't entirely sure what conclusion she was drawing herself. What she knew was this. She woke up the next morning, and the first thought in her head was whether Elias had checked the eastern stake markers after the storm, because a wind that strong could have shifted them, and if they shifted, the fence line would be off. She was out the door by 7. She told herself again that it was practical, that it was about the fence. By the time she arrived and saw him already at the eastern corner, resetting the markers that had indeed been knocked askew by the wind, already ahead of the problem she'd been worrying about, she stopped telling herself anything at all. She just tied her horse and picked up her tools. The fence was finished by the end of February. Not the whole perimeter, that would take another season, but the critical sections, the ones that defined the working boundary of what Elias intended to actually use in the spring. 230 feet of properly set, properly plumbed fence line, adjusted for drainage, anchored deep enough to survive the kind of freeze that had destroyed everything the previous families had tried to build here. Clara had walked every foot of it on the last day, checking the posts the way she'd check a patient's pulse, with focused, practiced attention. And when she got to the end, she turned around and looked back along the line and didn't say anything for a moment. It's good, she said finally. I know, Elias said. She looked at him sideways. That wasn't arrogance. That was just, you're allowed to say it. I know what it was. He was looking at the fence, too. I've been looking at it for a week. Still looks right every time. That was the closest either of them came, in those first months, to expressing satisfaction out loud. They both seemed to share an instinctive wariness about declaring things finished or successful, as if the land itself might overhear and decide to complicate matters. And the land, in the way that difficult land often does, kept its own counsel and gave nothing away about what spring would bring. What spring brought initially was mud, not the ordinary mud of a Montana thaw, but a deep, determined, almost philosophical mud that seemed to communicate a kind of hostility toward human projects. The fields that Elias had begun to turn in the final weeks of winter became treacherous, the top layer softening while the layer beneath stayed frozen, creating a false surface that would support weight for a moment and then give way suddenly, swallowing a boot to the ankle or sending a tool handle down into the earth at an angle that required real effort to retrieve. Elias worked through it because there wasn't another option, but it was ugly work and slow, and he came back to the farmhouse each evening with mud caked to his knees and a particular set to his jaw that Clara recognized as the expression he wore when things were harder than he'd planned for. She recognized it because she'd started seeing it enough to catalog it. By March, her visits had become less about the fence and more simply about being there, and both of them had more or less stopped pretending otherwise. She'd arrive in the morning, they'd work through the day, and she'd leave before dark. They ate lunch together, sitting on whatever was available. Upturned crates, fence sections, the tailgate of the supply sled, and had the kind of conversations that ranged easily from practical to personal without any deliberate navigation between the two. She learned that he didn't sleep well. that he'd been kicked by a horse 3 years ago and his left shoulder had healed slightly wrong, which explained the way he sometimes rolled it when he'd been working at the same angle too long, that he could cook about 4 things competently and had been eating variations of those 4 things for most of his adult life without seeming to find this particularly sad. He learned that she was a better rider than almost anyone in the county, including men who competed at it, that she'd wanted at 17 to study land management at a college back east, and her father had not forbidden it exactly, but had made his opinion of the idea so comprehensively clear that the wanting had eventually gone quiet on its own. That she had a temper she kept under careful management, and the management showed in the occasional moment when something crossed her expression and then disappeared, a flash of something hot, quickly contained. "Does it ever come out?" Elias asked once, about the temper. He'd asked it carefully, not provocatively. "Sometimes," she said, "when it matters enough." "What does it look like?" She considered. "Ask my father." He left that alone, which was the right call. Bon. The conversation with Victor that she'd referenced had happened in late February, 3 weeks after the storm, and it had been the kind of conversation that rearranges furniture in a relationship, not destroying anything permanently, but leaving things in different places than they'd been. Victor had come to her directly, which was unusual. He typically let things develop until he felt the moment was right, then moved decisively. The fact that he'd come to her before he felt ready told her the situation was bothering him more than he wanted to show. He'd found her in the stable, which was where she went when she needed to think, the smell of horses and hay being the particular sensory combination that had always helped her brain settle. She was checking the rear shoes on her mare when she heard his footsteps. She knew his footsteps the way you know the sounds of a house you've lived in for years. "I need to say something to you," he said. He didn't come into the stall. He stood at the entrance, which she understood as a form of respect, or at least an attempt at it. "All right," she said, not stopping what she was doing. "I'm going to go to Crowder's property myself, next week." She lowered the horse's hoof carefully, stood up. "Why are you telling me?" "Because I want you to know it's not personal." "It's entirely personal, Father." He was quiet for a moment, the particular quiet of a man who knows he's been accurately described but doesn't want to concede the point. "I have a responsibility to protect what we've built here," he said. "To protect you. That parcel, if it goes bad, and it will go bad, it's going to take someone down with it. I don't want that someone to be connected to this family." Clara turned to face him fully. "Elias Crowder has not asked anything of this family. He hasn't asked for money or land or connections or anything else. He bought his own property with his own money, and he is working it with his own hands. What exactly are you protecting us from?" "From—" Victor stopped, started again. "From the association. From watching you spend your time on a failing enterprise and being affected when it fails. You're protecting me from caring about something. I'm protecting you from being hurt." She looked at her father, this large, certain man who had spent 30 years being right about enough things that he'd stopped being able to distinguish between the things he actually understood and the things he'd simply decided. She felt the familiar frustration rise in her chest, that hot flash of it, and she let it show this time instead of containing it. "He's not failing," she said. "He's slower than planned because the ground is difficult and he's working alone, but he's not failing. The fence he's built is as good as anything on this property. The barn restoration is progressing. He knows this land, Father. Maybe not as long as you, but he reads it the same way. He pays attention." "Clara, go to his property," she said. "Talk to him if you want. Make your offer again. He'll say no again, and then maybe you'll understand that some people aren't moved by what you're offering." She walked past him out of the stable, which she would not have done 2 years ago. Something in the past few months had shifted in her. The months of purposeful work, of being listened to and taken seriously in a context where nobody was doing her any favors. And the shift had made certain old patterns of accommodation feel not just unnecessary, but genuinely impossible. Victor watched her go. His expression, had anyone been there to read it, was not angry. It was something more complicated. The look of a man encountering evidence that doesn't fit his existing model and not yet knowing how to incorporate it. He did go. He went on a Tuesday morning in early March, unannounced, riding up to Elias's property on his best horse, in a way that was probably not entirely unconscious signaling. Elias was working on the barn wall when he saw the rider coming. He recognized the Whitlock brand on the horse from 40 feet away and understood immediately who this was, because the posture alone communicated someone who was accustomed to arriving places and having that arrival mean something. He set down his tools, waited. Victor pulled up and looked at the barn work. Then he looked at the fence line, following it with his eyes for a long moment. Then he looked at Elias. "Victor Whitlock," he said. "I know," Elias said. "Elias Crowder." "I know." Victor dismounted. He was even larger up close. Not fat, just substantial, like he'd been built with extra material. He walked to the fence line and put his hand on one of the posts, tested it with real pressure. The post did not move. He walked along the line a few feet, examining the construction. Elias watched him without speaking. Finally, Victor turned around. "My daughter helped with this." "Some of it. She knew where the drainage adjustment needed to be made." "She grew up reading this valley," Victor said, and there was something in his voice that was hard to classify. Not quite pride, or not only pride, but something that recognized a fact he hadn't entirely expected to feel complicated about. "She's good at it," Elias said simply. Victor looked at him directly. "I'll offer you 3 times what you paid. Clear deed, no conditions." "No thank you." 4 times. "That's more than this land is worth to anyone but you." "Then you understand why I'm not selling." Victor's jaw tightened slightly. "Young man, I've been in this county for 30 years. I know this land. I know what happened to it in '82, and I know what it's cost every man who tried to work it since. You have grit, I can see that. But grit without capital is just a slower way to fail." Elias met his gaze and held it. "I appreciate you coming in person," he said, "and I hear what you're saying, but I'm not leaving." They looked at each other for a long moment, the kind of moment that isn't about words anymore. Victor got back on his horse. He looked down at Elias from the saddle. "My daughter is not part of whatever plan you have for this place." "She makes her own decisions," Elias said. "I expect you know that better than I do." Something shifted in Victor's expression, rapidly, briefly. Something that might have been recognition, or might have been the beginning of a problem he couldn't quite solve with the tools he normally used. He rode away without responding, which was not typically his way, and Elias watched him go and then picked up his tools and went back to work. So, April came, and the mud receded, and the fields showed their first real response to what Elias had been doing to them. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a sudden burst of green or a landscape transformation. It was subtler than that, a change in the quality of the soil when he turned it, a loosening that meant the compaction from years of neglect was beginning to break up. Clara noticed it before he mentioned it, crouching down in the near field and taking a handful of turned earth and feeling it in her palm the way you'd feel the quality of something you'd been waiting to change. "It's moving," she said. "Slowly." "Good soil moves slowly. Fast changes out here usually mean something's wrong." She let the earth fall from her hand. "This is going to produce." "Not this season." "No, but next." She stood up. "You're ahead of where I thought you'd be." He looked at her. "What did you think?" She was quiet for a moment, honest with it. "I thought you'd be good, but I thought the land would be too far gone. I thought you'd get to spring and find out the damage was deeper than either of us could fix in one winter." She paused. "I'm glad I was wrong." He was quiet for a moment, too. Then, "Why does it matter to you whether it works?" It was a direct question, and she could have deflected it. She'd deflected versions of it before, in her own head and occasionally in conversation, defaulting to the practical answers, the fence line, the shared property boundary, the agricultural interest. But it was April now, and they'd been working side by side for 5 months, and the direct question deserved the direct answer. "Because you matter to me," she said. "I think you know that." He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved behind his eyes that she'd learned to watch for. The subtle internal adjustment he made when something landed in a place he hadn't entirely prepared for. "Clara," he said, "you don't have to say anything back right now." "I know." He looked at the field. I was going to say that you matter to me too. I just wanted to make sure I was saying it right. She looked at him. You said it fine. Good. He picked up his spade. Because I'm not usually good at it. I noticed, she said, and he almost smiled, and they went back to work. It was May when the fire started, and nothing about that night gave any warning of what was coming. The evening had been ordinary in the particular way that ordinary evenings settle over a working ranch at the end of a long day. The light going golden, the temperature dropping to something comfortable after the warmth of afternoon, the sounds of animals settling. Elias had been patching a section of the barn roof and had come down from it with sore hands and a satisfying sense of a task that was now actually finished rather than ongoing. He ate supper, cleaned his tools, sat outside for a while in the cooling dark, which was something he did most evenings, not out of any particular sentiment, but because the silence of this land had become something he'd gotten accustomed to, and he admitted to himself had started to need. He went to bed around 9 and was asleep within minutes, which was also usual. Working the body hard had at least one reliable benefit. He woke up at what he later estimated was around midnight, though he had no clock to confirm it. What woke him was the smell. Not the fire itself, he couldn't see that from where he slept. But the smoke, carried on the southeasterly wind that came reliably through the valley at night, had found its way into the farmhouse and into whatever part of the brain doesn't entirely stop monitoring the environment, even in sleep. He was outside in 20 seconds. The glow was visible immediately, not on his property but to the east, in the direction of the Whitlock Ranch, a deep orange light pulsing behind the tree line in a way that meant the fire was substantial and had been going for some time before he'd woken. Even from 2 miles away, he could see that it was the barn area, the Whitlock main barn, the one that housed the prized breeding stock, the horses that Victor had spent 15 years selecting and breeding and which represented not just significant financial value, but a kind of living legacy of everything the man had built. Elias stood in the dark for about 4 seconds. Then he saddled his horse. He told himself later that he hadn't made a conscious decision, or at least not a deliberate one. The deliberate part of his brain was still coming online when his hands were already on the bridle. What moved him wasn't calculation, wasn't the consideration of what saving Victor Whitlock's horses might mean for his relationship with the man, or what Clara would think, or whether the risk was worth the potential return. He'd like to claim it was purely selfless, some innate heroism that asked nothing in return. But the honest truth was simpler than that and more complicated. He smelled smoke, he knew where it was coming from, and he could ride. So he rode. The scene at the Whitlock barn was worse than the glow had suggested. The south end of the structure was fully involved, orange flames pushing through the roof in 2 places, and the smell, pine wood, hay, and underneath it something acrid and chemical that he later understood was a can of turpentine that had been stored against the south wall, hitting him in a wave as he came through the gate. Ranch hands were running, which is what people do in the first minutes of a fire, running toward it, running away from it, running toward each other, looking for someone to tell them what to do. Gus was there, the foreman, organizing with the particular grim efficiency of someone who had dealt with emergencies before, but the water situation was bad. The nearest trough was being used to try to wet down the adjacent feed building, and there wasn't enough to fight the barn fire directly. Victor was there too, standing at the main barn doors, and his face in the firelight was something Elias had never seen on him. Stripped of the careful authority, just a man watching something he'd built being destroyed, looking for a way in that didn't seem to exist. The horses, Victor said when he saw Elias. Not questioning why he was there, just saying the words like a statement of the problem. North stalls. I got 3 out before the smoke. Elias was already off his horse. He pulled his work jacket over his head, wetted in the nearest trough, and went through the side door into the north section before anyone had time to suggest that was a bad idea. Inside was a version of darkness and chaos that his brain processed in pieces. Heat, immediate and aggressive, coming from the south wall of the main space. Smoke, lower than he expected, which meant he had more time than the outside looked like. The sound of horses, not screaming, which was the sound he'd been afraid of, but snorting and stamping, the contained panic of animals who know something is wrong but are still in the phase of hoping it resolves. He found the first stall by feel more than sight. The horse inside, a large bay gelding, was pushing at the gate with its chest, and Elias got the latch open and slapped its flank, and it bolted for the door he'd come through, which was still clear. Second stall. Third. By the third horse he was coughing steadily, and his eyes were running, and the heat from the south section was building in a way that changed the quality of the air into something you had to fight to breathe. He went back for the fourth. That was where it went wrong. The section of roof above the south center of the barn chose that moment to give way, not collapsing entirely, but dropping one end of a heavy beam that hit the floor 10 feet from where Elias was working and sent a cascade of burning material down the center aisle in a wave that cut off the route he'd been using to exit. He stood in the new configuration of the fire for a moment that felt longer than it was, recalculating. The horse in the stall next to him was now truly panicking, throwing itself against the gate, and he got it open more by brute force than skill, and it came out fast and caught him with its shoulder as it turned, a solid blow that knocked him sideways into the stall wall. He stayed upright. Barely. The exit route on the far north end was still clear. He moved for it, low and fast, and came out through the north door into cold air that tasted so clean and good after what he'd been breathing that he stood bent over with his hands on his knees for several seconds, just pulling it in. When he straightened up, Victor was there. The older man was looking at him with an expression that had nothing of the careful authority in it. Just something raw and unprocessed, the expression of a person who has just watched something happen that they weren't ready for. Elias was covered in soot and smelled like burning wood, and his right shoulder, the one that had already been wrong, was singing with pain from the horse's impact. 4, Elias said, his voice rougher than he expected. There were 4 in the north section? 4, Victor confirmed. His voice was strange too. Flat in a way that meant he was managing something. You got them all out. Elias nodded, coughed, wiped his face with the back of his hand, which accomplished nothing. The barn burned. There was nothing to do about that now except keep the fire from spreading, and Gus had the hands working on it in a way that was as organized as it was going to get. The structure itself was lost. But around the perimeter of the property, moving in confused circles and requiring wrangling from 3 different hands, were 7 horses. 3 Victor had gotten out, 4 Elias had come back for. Victor stood next to Elias, and they both watched the barn go. You didn't have to do that, Victor said. His voice was quiet, and it had something in it that Elias had not heard from the man before. I know, Elias said. Why did you? Elias thought about it honestly for a moment. Because the horses needed getting out, he said, and I could smell the smoke from my place. Victor was silent for a long time. You could have died in there, he said finally. Thought about that after, Elias said. Not during. Victor made a sound that might have been something other than what it appeared, something that started as one thing and had to be rerouted into something more manageable. He turned away slightly, looking at the fire, giving himself the cover of watching it. Clara arrived 20 minutes later, having woken to the glow and ridden hard. She came through the gate and looked at the burning barn and then at Elias. At the soot, the eyes still red from smoke, the way he was holding his right shoulder. And something crossed her face that she didn't try to hide or manage. She walked up to him and looked at him closely and said, Are you hurt? Shoulder, it'll be all right. She looked at him a moment longer, then she turned to her father. Victor was still watching the fire, and the firelight showed the lines of his face more clearly than daylight usually did. The years in them, the weight of them. He went in for the horses, she said to her father. Not as an argument, just as a fact she thought he should have stated clearly. I know, Victor said. He didn't turn around. I was here. None of them said anything else for a while. The fire burned down slowly, the way destructive things do when there's nothing left to hurry for. And the 3 of them stood in the field and watched it, each of them carrying something different in the silence. Each of them aware that the night had shifted something between them that couldn't be shifted back. The shoulder was worse than Elias let on that night. He knew it by morning, knew it the way you know a thing when the adrenaline has completely left, and what remains is just the body's honest accounting of what happened to it. The horse's impact had done something to the joint that wasn't a clean break, because he could still move it, but the pain that came with movement was the deep, specific kind that meant real damage rather than surface bruising. Every time he reached above shoulder height or tried to rotate the arm fully, something caught and ground in a way that made his vision go briefly white at the edges. He wrapped it himself with strips of cloth, binding the joint tightly enough to give it some stability, and went outside and stood in the early morning looking at what needed doing. It was the first week of May. The fields he'd been preparing since early spring were at the point where they needed real attention. The next 2 weeks were critical for whether the first modest crop would take or not. The fence repairs on the northwest section that he'd been putting off through the wet months couldn't wait much longer. The barn restoration was 40% complete, which meant it was still 40% a liability in bad weather. And now his primary arm was compromised in a way that wouldn't resolve on its own in time to matter. He stood there with his coffee going cold in his hand and did the arithmetic that he didn't want to do. Even working through the pain, and he was prepared to work through the pain because the alternative was watching everything he'd built start sliding backward. There were tasks on this list that simply could not be done by one person with one functional arm. Not in the time available. Not in the way they needed to be done to actually count. He went inside, ate breakfast, came back out. Did 3 hours of work he could manage with his left arm leading and his right doing as little as possible. By noon, the shoulder had swelled enough that the binding was feeling like a tourniquet, and he had to loosen it, which made everything worse in a different way. He sat down on the porch step. Not a dramatic collapse, just a deliberate, tired lowering of a man who needed to stop for a minute, and looked at the half-turned field, and the incomplete fence, and the barn that was better than it had been, but not yet what it needed to be. This was the thing he hadn't planned for. Not because he was naive about physical risk. Anyone working alone on a rebuilding project understood that injury was a possibility, but he'd planned around setbacks he could work through slowly, not setbacks that stopped him on a timeline that didn't have room for slow. He thought about Clara. He thought about what she would say if she came by and found him sitting on this step, looking at unfinished work. And then he thought about what she would actually say, which was different, because he'd learned enough about her by now to know she wouldn't perform concern or offer tidy solutions. She would look at the situation honestly and tell him what she thought, and what she thought would probably be right, and that was exactly the thing he found hardest to receive. She came the next morning, not because she'd planned to. She'd been planning to give him 2 days of space after the fire, intuiting that he'd need time to process what had happened the way he processed most things, which was privately and without narration. But she woke up thinking about the shoulder, about the way he'd been holding it by the end of the night, about the fact that the planting window didn't care about injuries or fires or any of the other complications that the month of May had decided to produce simultaneously. She found him at the northwest fence, working with his left hand more than his right, moving slower than she'd ever seen him move. He heard her coming and didn't stop, which was normal. But when she got closer, she could see the sweat on him for 9 o'clock in the morning and the careful way he was compensating. The extra bend at the waist to avoid raising his arm. The specific angle he'd found that let him get leverage without using the shoulder directly. She tied her horse and stood watching him for a moment. "How bad?" she said. "Manageable." "That's not what I asked." He set down the tool he was holding, turned to face her. He was pale under the dirt and the remnants of last night's soot that he hadn't fully washed off, and his eyes had the flat quality of someone who'd been running on something other than sleep. "Bad enough that I can't do the field work on the schedule I needed," he said, which was, for Elias, approximately the equivalent of another man sitting down and weeping. He didn't say things like that easily. Clara looked at the field, at the fence, at the barn. She was doing the same arithmetic he'd been doing, and she reached the same conclusions, and she stood with those conclusions for a moment without trying to immediately paper over them with false reassurance. "You need hands," she said. "I know. My father has hands he could spare for a week. 2 of the seasonal men came in early this year, and there's not full work for them yet until the Whitlock fields are ready." Elias was quiet. "Elias, I'll figure something out." She looked at him with an expression that was neither impatient nor particularly gentle, just direct, the way she looked at things when she'd decided she wasn't going to let them be more complicated than they needed to be. "You went into a burning barn for his horses," she said, Letting two of his hands help you turn a field for a week is not an equivalent exchange. You'd still be owed. It's not about the exchange. Then what is it about? He picked up the tool again, set it down. The shoulder was clearly not cooperating with the motion he'd intended, and the frustration of that, the purely physical frustration of a body not doing what was asked of it, crossed his face briefly before he controlled it. "I've been doing this alone," he said, "since the first day. That was the choice I made. This is my project, and my failure if it goes wrong. And I—" He stopped. "And you what?" "I don't want to owe your father something, not him." Clara was quiet for a moment. She understood that. She understood it better than she could easily explain because she knew something about being in Victor Whitlock's debt, about the subtle way he kept accounts, not maliciously, not even consciously, but the way some people do, where every kindness given becomes a kind of claim. She'd grown up navigating those claims, but she also understood that the field wouldn't plant itself. "Let me ask you something," she said. "If it was me with the bad shoulder, if I was the one who couldn't do what needed doing, what would you do?" He looked at her. "I'd help you," he said. After a short pause, "That's not the same." "Why not?" "Because—" He stopped again, looked at the unplanted field. She could see him working through something, the internal adjustment that she'd learned to recognize, the moment where the argument he was making to himself started losing to the argument he was hearing. "Because asking for help feels like admitting the plan was wrong," he said finally. It came out quieter than the rest of what he'd said, the particular quietness of something that has been true for a long time and hasn't been said out loud before. Clara sat down on the fence rail. "The plan wasn't wrong," she said. "A horse hit you. That's not a flaw in the plan. If I'd come out of that barn faster, you would have left a horse inside." She looked at him steadily. "Which is not who you are, and we both know it." He was quiet for a long time, long enough that a hawk passed overhead, and both of them watched it without acknowledging that they were watching it. "I'll talk to your father," he said finally. It cost him something. She could see it cost him something, and she didn't minimize that, just received it. "I'll go with you," she said. "No." He looked at her. "This one I need to do myself." He rode to the Whitlock Ranch that afternoon, shoulder-wrapped and jaw set in the way that meant he'd committed to a direction and wasn't going to revisit it. Victor was in the yard when he arrived, supervising the cleanup from the fire. The ruins of the barn had been partially cleared, and the smell of wet ash was still heavy in the air, a smell that would probably live in that corner of the property for years. He saw Elias coming and said something to the hand he'd been talking with, and the hand moved away. They met in the middle of the yard, which felt slightly formal, like two men who'd been circling each other for months and had finally agreed on a location. "Crowder," Victor said. "Mr. Whitlock." Elias didn't reach to shake hands, which Victor would have read correctly as a pain management decision rather than a social one. "I need to ask you something." Victor waited. "I've got a 2-week window on my fields that I can't fully work because of the shoulder. I heard you've got seasonal hands who aren't at full work yet." He said it straight, no preamble, no softening. "I'd like to borrow 2 men for a week. I can't pay much now, but come harvest I'd pay properly, with interest if you want it." Victor looked at him. His expression was unreadable in the way it usually was. That careful blankness that Elias had learned was not absence of thought, but the opposite. The face of a man thinking hard behind a neutral surface. "No interest?" Victor said. Elias started to respond. "I'm not done," Victor said. "No interest, and you don't owe me for the labor. I'll send 3 men, not 2, and they'll work your fields for 10 days. Elias looked at him. "That's more than I asked for." "I know what it is. I'm not looking for charity." "I know that too." Victor's voice had something in it that was neither apologetic nor soft, but that carried a weight different from the authority he usually projected, something that had been there since the night of the fire and hadn't gone away. "I watched you go into that barn. I watched you come out with 4 horses and half the smoke in Montana in your lungs, and I didn't—" He paused. I didn't say what needed saying at the time. You don't need to say anything. I know I don't need to. I'm choosing to. Victor looked at him with the pale gray eyes that had always felt like they were reading something private. You didn't come to help me because you wanted something in return. I'm not sending my men because I want something in return. That's a different kind of transaction. Elias stood with that for a moment. The thing about Victor Whitlock was that when he said something plainly, it had a quality of finality to it. Not arrogance, but the certainty of a man who didn't often say the plain thing and therefore meant it absolutely when he did. 3 men, 10 days, Elias said. I'll feed them. Fair enough? There was a pause that was different from the pauses they'd had before. Not adversarial, not cautious. Just 2 men who'd arrived somewhere neither of them had been planning to go. The shoulder, Victor said. You had someone look at it? Not yet. Victor's expression moved slightly. There's a doctor in town. Harlan. Decent man. Not a drunk. He paused. I can send word to have him ride out. I can ride to town. You'd ride to town on a bad shoulder rather than let someone come to you. Elias looked at him. I'm working on it, he said, which was the most honest thing he could have said, and from the slight adjustment in Victor's expression, the older man understood what he meant. The 3 hands arrived the next morning. 2 young men named Cutter and Pete, who worked with the easy physical competence of people who'd been doing this since before they had opinions about it, and an older hand called Harmon, who didn't say much but had clearly been farming Montana soil long enough to know its specific tempers and requirements. Elias showed them what he needed, and they got to work without ceremony, which suited everyone. He worked alongside them with his left arm and his judgment, directing, making decisions, doing what he could, accepting that some of what needed doing would be done by other hands. It was the hardest part of the 10 days. Not the physical limitation, but the watching. Standing at the edge of a field that was his and watching other men work it, even well, even correctly, even in exactly the way he would have if the shoulder were right. He stood there the first morning for about an hour before Harmon walked over to him during a water break and said, without looking at him directly, You're doing that thing where you supervise like you're apologizing. Elias looked at him. What? Standing there like you owe us something for being here. Harmon took a long drink of water. We're working. You're managing. Both things need doing. He handed the water back and walked to the next section without elaborating. Elias stood there a moment, then he went to find something useful to do with one arm. Clara came every day. She didn't make a production of it. She worked alongside whoever needed help, talked with Harmon about the soil composition in the east field, showed Cutter the drainage markers she and Elias had set in the winter so the irrigation wouldn't fight the land's natural movement. She was useful in the practical way she always was, and her presence had the quality Elias had come to rely on, which was a kind of steadiness that didn't require anything from him except to be there too. On the 4th day, when the light was going long and gold over the fields, and the hands had ridden back to the Whitlock property for the night, Clara and Elias sat on the porch step, the same step he'd sat on alone a week ago doing arithmetic that scared him, and looked at what the 4 days of work had accomplished. It was visible, unmistakably, concretely visible. The near field was turned and seeded, the rows clean and properly spaced, the drainage channels clear. The northwest fence section was repaired. The barn roof work was done. More had been accomplished in 4 days with proper help than Elias could have managed in 3 weeks alone. This is what it looks like, Clara said. What looks like? Things going right. She said it simply, without ornament. I thought you should notice it. You don't always notice when things go right. He looked at the field. I notice. You notice when things could still go wrong. He was quiet for a moment. Old habit. I know. She wasn't criticizing it, just naming it, the way she named things. You can keep the habit, just add the other one. He looked at her. She was looking at the field, the last light catching the side of her face in a way that made her look both younger and more certain than usual. He'd been thinking about something for a while, not for days, but for longer, for the slow accumulation of mornings and working afternoons and evenings sitting in the farmhouse with the stove going and conversation that moved easily between the functional and the true. "Clara," he said. She turned to look at him. "I'm not good at talking around things," he said, "so I'm going to say it straight, all right? I want to build this place into something real, a real working ranch, something that lasts." He paused. "I want to do that with you. Not with you helping me as a neighbor, not with you coming by because the fence line interests you. With you here, this being yours too." She looked at him for a long moment. He couldn't quite read what was moving behind her eyes, which was unusual. He'd gotten reasonably good at reading her, but this was something she was processing on a level below expression. "Are you asking me to marry you?" she said. "I'm saying I want that. Yes, when you're ready. When this place is enough of something that you're not choosing it out of." He stopped. "I want it to be a real choice, not a rescue mission." Something shifted in her face. Not softening, exactly. Claire's face didn't soften the way people in stories were described as softening. It was more like the careful management she usually maintained became briefly unnecessary, and what was underneath it was simpler and more certain than she usually let show. "Elias," she said, "I have been choosing this every morning for 5 months. Every morning I wake up and choose to ride west instead of doing something else. That is not a rescue mission. That is a preference." She paused. "My preference is you." He looked at her. Something happened in his chest that he couldn't have named precisely. Not relief, because that wasn't quite right. More like the specific feeling of a weight he'd been carrying so long, he'd forgotten it was weight finally acknowledging itself by shifting. "I don't have a ring," he said. "I didn't ask for one. I'll get one." Eventually," she said, "when there's money for it." "Before there's money for it," he said, which made her look at him with something that was as close to surprised as Clara Whitlock got. He rode to town the following morning and got his shoulder looked at by the doctor Victor had mentioned, who turned out to be as competent as advertised and considerably more direct than most. The verdict was a partially torn ligament that had already begun to heal in roughly the right direction, aided, the doctor said, by the fact that Elias had kept it immobilized enough in the first days that it hadn't been redamaged. He'd have real use of it within 3 weeks if he was careful, 4 if he kept doing what he was apparently doing, which was using it anyway. "You need to rest it," the doctor said, in the tone of a man who had said this sentence to Montana ranchers before and knew exactly how much good it did. 3 weeks, Elias said, preferably 6. 3, the doctor sighed. "Come back if the swelling returns." Elias paid him, rode to the general store, spent 40 minutes making a decision that his budget said he couldn't make yet, but that he'd decided he was making anyway, and rode home with a small package in his coat pocket. He found Clara at the farm, which no longer surprised him, working with Harmon on the east field while Cutter and Pete finished the barn siding. She looked up when he rode in and read something in his face immediately, the way she read things. He walked over to her. She dismissed herself from the conversation with Harmon so naturally that the older man didn't break stride. Elias took the small package from his pocket, opened it. It wasn't expensive. It was the best he could find in Harlan County for what he had, which was a simple gold band with a small setting, modest by most measures, but not cheap, and clean in the way he liked things to be clean. Clara looked at it, then at him. "You said before there's money," she said. "I said I would." He held it out. "Clara Whitlock, I'm not going to make a speech. You know what I think and what I want and what this place is going to be. Will you be part of it?" She took the ring from his hand, looked at it for a moment, put it on. "Yes," she said. Not dramatically, not with tears or declaration. Just the word. Plainly, the way she said things she meant absolutely. Behind them, Harmon pretended to find something interesting in the soil composition of the east field. Cutter and Pete, who had seen the whole thing from the barn, said nothing, but one of them accidentally dropped a tool with a clatter that nobody acknowledged. The field needed another 4 days of work. The barn needed finishing. The northwest corner had a post that Elias still wasn't satisfied with, and would probably reset when his shoulder allowed. There was a whole season of uncertainty ahead, whether the soil would deliver on what it had begun to promise, whether the small herd he was planning to acquire would hold through the summer, whether the 100 other things that could go wrong in a first real season on difficult land would stay manageable. None of that had resolved, None of it was finished or certain. But the field was seeded, the fence was standing, and the woman who had come to convince him to leave was standing in his east field, wearing his ring and looking at the land the way she looked at things she had decided to keep. That was enough for today. Tomorrow would ask its own questions, and they would answer them the same way they'd answered everything else. Together, one problem at a time, on ground that was finally, slowly, learning to give something back. Victor Whitlock found out about the engagement the way powerful men in small counties usually found out about things. Not from the people involved, but from the general atmosphere of a place that had already absorbed the information and was quietly redistributing it. It was Gus who told him, because Gus told him most things eventually, in the same flat way he communicated everything, as if the emotional content of information was someone else's department. He came into the kitchen on a Thursday morning while Victor was eating breakfast and said, "Heard Crowder put a ring on Miss Clara," and then went to pour himself coffee like he'd commented on the weather. Victor sat with his fork halfway to his mouth for a moment. Then he set it down, pushed back from the table, stood up and walked to the window that faced west, toward the property line that separated Whitlock land from the parcel that everyone in the county had written off 18 months ago. He stood there for a while. Gus drank his coffee and didn't say anything else, because 15 years of working for Victor Whitlock had given him an accurate sense of when additional words were useful and when they weren't. "She didn't tell me herself," Victor said finally. "No," Gus agreed. Victor was quiet again. He was thinking about a conversation he'd had with Clara when she was 19, when she'd wanted to go east to study, and he'd made his feelings known in the comprehensive, certain way he made his feelings known about most things, and she'd gone quiet in a way that he'd read at the time as acquiescence. He understood now, with the specific clarity that came from watching her operate in the world for the past several months, that it hadn't been acquiescence. It had been a young woman deciding that some arguments weren't worth having with someone who wasn't ready to hear them. He'd done the same thing to her about Elias, made his position known, made it large and clear and unambiguous, and she'd heard it and filed it in whatever place she kept the opinions of people she loved but didn't intend to be governed by. The problem was, she'd been right and he'd been wrong, and Victor Whitlock did not have a lot of practice with that particular combination. He picked up his hat. "I'm riding out," he said. "West?" Gus said. "West." Clara was in the near field when she saw her father's horse coming through the gate. She straightened up, shielded her eyes, and watched him come, calculating, the way she always calculated with Victor, what mood the posture suggested, what the unannounced arrival meant, whether this was going to be the conversation that went badly or the one she'd been waiting for without knowing exactly what form it would take. Elias was at the barn. She could hear the intermittent sounds of him working. The shoulder was better now, 3 weeks on, not right but functional, and she considered for a moment going to get him and decided against it. This one was hers first. Victor pulled up and dismounted and looked at the field. He looked at it for a real amount of time, which she recognized as him actually seeing it rather than glancing at it to be polite. The near field was showing green, not lush, not dramatic, but real and even, the rows of early crop coming up in a way that meant the soil had taken and the drainage plan had worked and the long winter of preparation was converting into something visible. "It's coming up," he said. "It is." She waited. He looked at her hand, at the ring, back at her face. "You could have told me." "I was going to. I wanted to wait until I was ready for the conversation." "And now?" "Now you're here, so I suppose I'm ready." She looked at him steadily. "I'm going to marry him, Father. I'd like your blessing, but I've thought about what I'll do if I don't get it, and I'm prepared for that too. I want you to know that, so we're not pretending." Victor looked at her, this woman who had his wife's directness and his own stubbornness and some third thing that was entirely her own, something that had apparently been developing for years while he wasn't paying close enough attention. He felt, not for the first time in recent months, the uncomfortable sensation of recognizing that a person he thought he knew had been more than he'd been seeing. "I was wrong about him," Victor said. It was 4 words. Clara held them carefully because they were not words her father produced easily or often, and the fact that he'd led with them, rather than working up to them, told her something about how much this had cost him to arrive at. "I know," she said. I want to say it clearly. He looked toward the barn, toward the sounds of Elias working. I judged the man by what he didn't have. I didn't look at what he was. A pause. What he is. Clara was quiet for a moment. He went into that barn because that's who he is, she said. Not for us, not to change your mind, just because that's what he does when something needs doing. I know that now. Victor's voice had the particular roughness of a man managing something he doesn't have good technique for. That's the thing that... He stopped, started again. A man who acts right when there's nothing in it for him is a different kind of man than I gave him credit for being. From the barn, the sounds of work had gone quiet. Elias had noticed the visitor. He came around the side of the barn and walked toward them at an ordinary pace, not hurried, not cautious. He stopped about 10 feet away and looked at Victor, and Victor looked at him, and the two of them stood in the morning light on the better-than-it-used-to-be ground of this improbable little ranch. Whitlock, Elias said. I hear you're marrying my daughter, Victor said. That's the plan. Victor looked at him for a long moment. Then he did something that Elias had not expected and Clara had not quite dared to hope for. He extended his hand. Not an offering, not a gesture designed for any particular effect. Just a hand held out between them, the way men in that time and place acknowledged something real. Elias reached out and shook it. You'll need cattle, Victor said. If you're serious about making this a working ranch rather than a farming operation, the land can handle both from what I can see. You've got the grass for a small herd. I've been thinking about that, Elias said, looking at what I can afford to start with. I have 12 head I was planning to sell to an outfit in the north. I'll bring them here instead. Same price, which is fair market. You can pay when the first harvest comes in. He said it in the way he said business things, flatly, without apparent generosity, just the logic of a transaction. But they all understood it wasn't just a transaction. Elias looked at him for a moment. That's a fair offer, he said. Thank you. Victor nodded, looked at the field again. The drainage correction. That was Clara's idea? She saw what I didn't. Without her, the fence would have been wrong from the start. Something moved in Victor's expression. Something he contained quickly, but not before both of them saw it. Pride, maybe. Or the recognition of something about his daughter he'd been carrying without knowing exactly where to put it. She always could read this valley, he said quietly. To no one in particular. Chip. They were married in September when the first harvest was in. It wasn't a large wedding because neither of them wanted a large wedding, and because the ranch was still a work in progress and spending money on ceremony felt wrong to both of them in the same instinctive way. Clara wore a dress that had been her mother's, altered to fit her, which required work but which felt like the right thing to use. Elias wore his good coat, freshly repaired, the crack in the left boot sole properly resoled at last. Gus attended. Harmon came, and Cutter and Pete, who had apparently decided they were invested in this particular outcome after their 10 days of work in the spring. A handful of people from town who had, in the intervening 18 months, quietly revised their opinion of the man who'd bought the dead ranch and the woman who'd apparently known something they didn't. Dobbins, the land agent, came. He stood near the back with an expression that mixed genuine pleasure with the mild discomfort of a man who is forced to remember saying something confident and incorrect. Victor stood at the front because Clara had asked him to stand with her, and he did it without making it complicated, which was its own kind of growth. After, they ate outside because the September weather in that part of Montana had decided to be kind, and there was food that Clara and two women from town had spent 2 days preparing, and there was whiskey that was not excellent but was sufficient, and there was the specific noise of people who are genuinely happy being in the same place at the same time. Late in the evening, when most of the guests had gone, and the ones who remained were sitting in loose groups in the cooling air, Victor found himself standing next to Elias at the fence. The original fence, the first section Elias had built alone in November, the 60 feet that had been there since the beginning. Victor put his hand on a post the way he had on the day he'd come to make his offer. The post didn't move. You built this in November, Victor said, before you had help, before you knew if any of it was going to work. Yes. Why did you start with the fence? Elias considered the question. Because without a perimeter, you don't have anything to protect. And if you don't have anything to protect, You don't have a reason to keep building." Victor was quiet. He was looking at the post, but he was thinking about something else. Elias could tell from the particular quality of the silence, which was the silence of a man doing something internal that required his full attention. "I started with the cattle," Victor said, "when I first came here, 30 years ago. Bought 12 head before I had a fence post in the ground." He paused. "Lost 4 of them in the first month because I didn't have proper containment." Elias looked at him. It was the first time Victor had ever offered him anything from his own history. Any admission of a mistake made or a lesson learned the hard way. "But you kept the other 8, Elias said. "Kept them, bred them, built around them." Victor let go of the fence post. "Point is, everybody starts wrong somewhere. It's what you do after the first loss that determines what you're building." He walked back toward the remaining guests, and Elias stood at the fence for a while after he left, thinking about that. About the specific wisdom of a man who'd built something real, admitting, plainly, that he'd made mistakes at the beginning. It was the most useful thing Victor Whitlock had ever said to him. The years that followed were not a smooth upward line. No real thing ever is. The second season brought a drought in July that damaged the East Field and forced Elias to make decisions about water allocation that cost him sleep and produced his first real argument with Clara. Not a vicious argument, but a real one, the kind that 2 people have when they're both under stress and both think they're right, which in this case they more or less both were, approaching the same problem from different angles. They worked it out, not quickly and not without some silence between them that lasted longer than comfortable, and the solution they reached was better than either of their individual positions. They took that forward as a kind of operating principle. In the 3rd year, a disease moved through the small herd and took 3 of the animals before they understood what they were dealing with and could bring in proper treatment. Victor lost cattle too, that same season, something that moved through the valley without asking permission. And it was Elias who rode over when he heard, not to offer solutions, but because that was what you did. He helped Victor's hands with the containment work for 2 days, came home exhausted and quiet, and Clara fed him and didn't ask him to talk about it, which was what he needed. The barn was completed in the fall of the 2nd year, properly completed, not just functional but solid, built to last through the kind of winter that had destroyed everything before. Elias stood inside it on the day it was finished and looked at the timber frame and the roof and the stalls and felt something he couldn't have named precisely, but that had to do with permanence, with something that would still be standing after he wasn't, with feet. Clara found him in there after a while. She stood next to him and looked at the same things he was looking at. "Your father's barn was built in a week," she said. 5 men, 1 week. "I know, he told me. This one took 2 years. "Better for it," he said. She looked at him. "Yes," she said. "I think so too." By the 5th year, the ranch that Harlan County had written off as a graveyard of broken fences and bad luck was producing in a way that required Elias to hire his first permanent hand, a young man from town named Russell, who was 17 and reminded Elias uncomfortably of himself at that age, which meant he was harder on the boy than strictly necessary in some moments, and more patient than expected in others, and Clara told him so with characteristic directness. "You're doing to him what your foreman on the cattle drive did to you," she said one evening. Elias looked up. "Which part?" "The part where you push him past what's comfortable because you know he can handle it, but he doesn't know yet." She paused. "That part's fine. The part where you forget to tell him he did something right. That part's what Ferris did that you never forgot." Elias thought about that. The next morning he found Russell resetting a gate hinge that had been giving trouble for a week, a small, unglamorous task that the boy had just fixed on his own initiative without being asked. "That's good work," Elias said in passing. Not a speech, not a ceremony, just the acknowledgement. Russell looked up, surprised, and then looked quickly back at what he was doing because he was 17 and not sure how to receive a compliment from a man he respected. But he carried himself differently for the rest of that day, and Elias noticed and thought about what Ferris's small stone in his pocket had meant to him across years of difficult terrain. Victor came to dinner on the first Sunday of every month. It had started awkwardly. The first few visits were careful, navigated like conversations between people who are trying not to break something they're not sure is fully healed yet. But over time, it became simply a fact of the calendar, unremarkable and expected. The way good habits eventually stopped feeling like effort. He got older in the way that big men get older, slowly and then suddenly faster. The gray in his hair went from distinguished to total. He walked with a cane for 6 months after a horse threw him in the 4th year, hated the cane with a focused personal loathing, and abandoned it before his knee was ready, which set his recovery back considerably and which Elias and Clara both knew better than to comment on. He talked about Clara's mother more as time went on. He'd mention something she'd said or describe how she'd handled something. In the casual way you mention someone who's still present in your daily thinking, even if they're not present anywhere else. Elias listened without comment, and Clara sometimes added something she remembered, and they let the woman who wasn't there take up the space she deserved at the table. One evening, near the end of the 5th year, Victor was sitting on the porch after dinner, a habit he'd developed, taking the evening air before the ride home. And Elias came out and sat nearby, not right next to him, but within conversation distance. They sat for a while without talking. "I've been thinking about leaving the ranch to Clara," Victor said. "When the time comes." Elias was quiet. "I know she has this place," Victor continued. "And this place is yours, not mine. And I don't mean to complicate what you've built here." He paused. "I just mean that what I built should go to her, because it was always partly hers. I just didn't see that while I was building it." "She'll run it well," Elias said. "Better than I did, in some respects." He said it without obvious pain, which meant he'd been working up to saying it for a while and had made peace with it. "She has the eye for it, the patience." "She has both." Victor was quiet for a moment. "I thought she'd end up with someone from an established family, someone with land already, status. I thought that was what would make her life." He stopped. "I was building the life I wished I'd had, not the one she wanted." Elias didn't say anything to that, because there wasn't anything useful to add. It was true, and Victor knew it was true, and sometimes the most respectful thing you can do with someone's admission is just let it stand. "She's happy," Victor said. The way he said it made clear that this had taken him some time to believe completely, but that he believed it now. "I know," Elias said. "I'm aware of that every day." Victor nodded, finished his coffee, stood up, slower than he used to, and picked up his hat. "You built something real here," he said, "out of nothing." "Not nothing," Elias said. "The bones were always here, just needed someone to stop walking past them." Victor looked at him. Then he looked out at the property, at the barn that took 2 years, at the fence that started with 60 feet in November, at the fields that had required a winter of preparation and a season of faith before they gave anything back. At the small herd moving in the distance in the last of the evening light, 12 head now, healthy, the line of them a quiet kind of proof. "I should have seen what you saw in it," Victor said quietly. "You see it now," Elias said. Victor put his hat on, rode home in the dark the way he'd ridden many things in his long life, steadily, without complaint, toward what was waiting for him. On a morning in the 6th year, Elias Crowder woke before light the way he always did and stood on the porch with his coffee and looked at the property in the dark. He'd done this since the first week. Before the fence was finished, before the barn was rebuilt, before the fields had shown anything worth showing. He'd stood in this same spot, or near enough, and looked at this land in the particular darkness before dawn when you can't see details, only shapes, only the mass of things, only the outline of what exists against the sky. In the first winter it had been broken shapes, fallen things, leaning things, the geometry of failure and abandonment. Now the shapes were different. The barn stood square and solid against the sky. The fence line ran clean and straight to the eastern boundary and beyond. The fields were dark and quiet in the pre-dawn, but he knew what was in them, what was growing, what was coming, what the next season held. The herd was somewhere out in the near pasture, their breathing part of the property's general sound, which was the sound of a living place. He heard the door behind him. Clara came out with her own coffee, still half asleep in the way she was in the mornings. Slower than she'd be by 8 o'clock, quieter, content to be present without performing wakefulness. She stood next to him and looked at the same dark shapes. "Cold this morning," she said. "Little bit." They stood in it together, the cold and the dark and the shapes of the things they'd built on ground everyone else had given up on. This was the truth of it. Not the dramatic moments, not the night of the fire, or the morning with the ring, or the afternoon when Victor shook his hand. Those were real, and they mattered, and they were part of the story. But the story was also this: two people standing in the dark on an ordinary morning, drinking coffee, looking at something they'd made together out of difficulty and stubbornness, and the specific faith that comes not from certainty, but from deciding that you're going to continue anyway. The land had not been easy. It had not become easy. Montana ground in the late 1800s did not become easy. It became known, which was different. You learned its difficult places and its capacities, and you worked within them, and you stopped expecting it to be other than what it was. And in exchange, it gave you what it could, which turned out, year by year, season by season, to be enough. The man who had stood at this property line with $10 in cracked boot soles, and an idea that everyone around him considered foolish, was not the same man standing here now. Not because the hard parts had made him someone else, but because continuing through the hard parts, choosing every morning to stay and work and build, had clarified him, had shown him and the people around him what was actually there underneath the determination. The specific quality of a person who is not moved by what other people think is reasonable. That quality was not heroic in any clean cinematic sense. It was stubborn and sometimes maddening and occasionally wrong. And it had required Clara's knowledge and her honesty and her willingness to stay to become what it eventually became. Neither of them had built this alone. That was the other truth. The one Elias had been slowest to learn but had learned most thoroughly. Strength was not the ability to carry everything yourself. It was knowing when to carry and when to hand something to the person next to you and trusting that they would hold it the same way you would. The dark was starting to go at the edges. That thin blue light that came before actual sunrise, the one that showed you shapes, were becoming real again. Clara put her hand on the fence rail. The original section, still standing after 6 years, still solid because he'd set it right the first time, even when everything else was uncertain. "Another day," she said. "Another day," he agreed. They stood there until the light came, and when it did, they went to work.